Now it's my pleasure to introduce Natalie Jenner, and this is her book, just fresh off the shelves in May, the Jane Austen Society, and it has wonderful reviews from the New York Times, the Washington Post. I won't read them all. We'll do a follow-up to this Zoom meeting for everybody who participated and give you some of those quotes, but it's wonderful. Natalie will tell you more about her life experiences, but she was born in England, raised in Canada, and she founded an independent bookstore, Archetype Books, in Oakville, Ontario. And that's where she lives with her family and her two wonderful rescue dogs. This is her first novel, her debut, and it's available from St. Martin's Press. And it's already been translated, or the rights to translation are sold in 10 countries, which is quite amazing. She has a BA from the University of Toronto St. Michael's College, where she was a 1990 gold medalist in English literature. And she has a law degree from the University of Toronto, her LLB. She has practiced law, corporate law. She's had a wide-ranging career. She's been a career coach, recruiter, consultant to law firms for the last 20 years. And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Natalie Jenner.
I'm going to mute everybody again because some people got unmuted. So Natalie, when I do that, unmute yourself, please. Here we go.
Okay, are we all right now? So thumbs up from Susie. You can hear me and see me fine, Emily and Susie? Wonderful. Okay. Hi, everybody. I am Natalie Jenner. I am the author of this book, The Jane Austen Society. The first thing you need to know is that it's a work of historical fiction. It is about a group of 8 very different people that come together at the end of World War II to try and save the cottage where Austen had lived. And I have, well, I'm debut author at age 52, but I've wanted to be a writer for almost as long as that, 50 years. And I've been in love with Jane Austen since I was about 10. So as Susie was saying with my biography, I studied English literature and then law, and I was in the legal profession as a lawyer and then a coach for 3 decades. And during that time, I also tried to get 5 different books published to absolutely no outside interest or avail. And it's with quite an astonishment that I find myself sitting here today talking about my very fictional book called The Jane Austen Society with a real life Jane Austen Society. So first of all, I am so grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you all today about my book. The story about my book really starts in 2017. I spent a year of my life aggressively rereading Jane Austen. I was trying to cope with a very difficult time involving my husband medically. And never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that just a few short years later, I would finally get published and have opportunities like this. So this is essentially today the story of how Jane Austen saved my life and has forever changed my life. So people sometimes ask how I was first introduced to Jane Austen. And it's right next to me. It is my mother's edition of Pride and Prejudice. And I show it because it's a book that comes in a box. And this is one of the books that we were not allowed to touch when we were little, and of course I did. I was fascinated by a book being in a box, but also it had lovely illustrations, which was also unusual for my parents' library. And the reason I mention this is because I think the thing that happened for me at age 10 was I was reading the first chapter of Pride and Prejudice, which, as everyone knows, is very dialogue heavy and very rich right away in terms of characterizing Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. And I remember being able to read it at age 10, which is a reflection of Austen's genius and her comprehensibility. And I remember going, oh my God, these are my parents. And then I was thinking, like, these are kind of like everybody's parents. And then given my love for this book, my father, when I was 12, gave me this anthology, which you can see is quite stained along the side. And I would spend my teens reading all the books, like I'm sure all of you. So the only other kind of encounter with Jane Austen I had when I was young was a friend's father was reading Pride and Prejudice, and we were up at the farmhouse for the weekend celebrating her 16th birthday. And I found him in the front parlor of the farmhouse, And in my imaginative fervor, he is sitting there with a decanter and some port next to him, and the fire is raging, and he's laughing, which I'd never seen an adult do while they were reading. And I had to ask him what he was reading, and he said Pride and Prejudice. And from that moment, never once would I have thought that she was considered by popular culture as increasingly a writer for women, which was something that I'm really grateful for. I studied English literature and was studying the greats, and she was one of them as well. So that was really the extent of my exposure to her, because this is in the early to mid 1980s. And so it's the only other thing I think that is worth mentioning in relation to my book is that I was born in England and I spent my first few years there. So I loved when I got older and had the means as a university student to go back to England, stay with my relatives, and I would travel all over and I would make literary pilgrimages to different homes of my favorite authors, Virginia Woolf and Henry James, Thomas Hardy, the Brontes. But the most extensive pilgrimage I ever made was when I was 21. I made a 4-day trip on my own, and I went to Bath and then Lyme Regis and then Winchester and then Chawton. And over the years, I would make many trips back to England, but I would not get back to Chawton for 25 years. Besides reading and rereading Jane Austen and making literary pilgrimages, the other thing I wanted to mention up front is that over the ensuing decades of my life, I always turned to Jane Austen for solace as well as entertainment. When I was a young corporate lawyer in a tech boom, and I was working on a ton of M&A, and I threw my back out, and all the lawyers along the wall sent me a get well card. And in it, one of my friends wrote, happiness is not having to is being too sick to go to work, but not too sick to read Jane Austen. And on a sadder note, when my husband was diagnosed with, fortunately, what turned out to be early stage kidney cancer when our daughter was very young, and he had to have his kidney removed, the first thing my best friend did was mail me a copy for fun of a book called Mr. Darcy Takes a Wife. So these are just examples of difficult times, but in good times as well. I found that whenever I read Jane Austen, I never wanted to leave her world. And whenever I finished one of her books, I would always try and grab whatever current retellings or sequels I could find at the bookstore, just so I could stay in her world a little longer. So when I'm in my late 40s, my husband's health is stable, and my daughter is in high school, and I have a bit more time to myself, I decided to open a bookshop. And it was a really exhilarating time. But this is where things start to turn for us in terms of our family life. 4 months after opening the shop, my husband is suddenly diagnosed with a very rare form of lung disease. It will actually take about 1.5 years for all the pieces to fall into place. But he's found to have something that is terminal and incurable called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So I have to sort of build the store up at the same time that I'm taking it apart, which is a really bizarre energy. And we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know for sure at all how much time we had. The doctors did say to us that the vast majority of patients will pass away within 2 to 3 years of the diagnosis. And we were a relatively young family. Our daughter was 14. So we had to make some very tough decisions. And one of them was to shut down the bookstore, which I ran single-handedly, and I was there all the time. And we hoped we could spend a bit more time with our daughter, her last few years of high school, and take bucket list trips together as a family. The only other thing I wanted to do was reread Jane Austen. The good news I want to let you know up front is that there are a few drugs that can slow down the progressiveness of the fibrosis in the lungs that my husband deals with. It is genetic in his family. It is a disease that has killed his mother and his aunt, and he and his brother both have it. So we know that things will change for us. But right now, through these drugs, I'm happy to tell you that he is still healthful, and his lung function remains in the 70 percentile range. Because of what's going on in the world, we have not left our house in 4 months. My energy is a little off when I talk. I'm just so happy to be talking, even to this like little camera. But at the time, we didn't know how much time we had. And as I'm rereading Jane Austen to get through this very difficult time of uncertainty, I've reread her my entire life, but this time, something different was happening for me. And I think it was that I was dramatically able to stretch my understanding of her for me in a way that I hadn't before, because I was coming at her in such an intense time of uncertainty and grief. This time when I came back to Austen, I felt a very interesting and very strong connection to her. And not to be too romantic about it, but it did feel as if she'd always kind of been waiting for me in terms of her works, for me to catch up to her. And at the end of her life, her own wrestling, I'm sure, with uncertainty and fear of what was happening, you know, with her own health. So as I reread these books, I'm processing that they're solving or at least ameliorating a huge amount of my emotional pain. They're giving me hope. They're giving me comfort. And I wanted to, on an intellectual level, explore that connection. I wanted to understand how she could do it. So I started to read a lot about her because I felt intuitively that her as a person, her life story, and how she had made decisions as an author, as a sister, as a daughter, and as a friend, that there were lessons in there for me too. And I wanted to find a way personally to engage better with life, to maintain hope. And I had a feeling that she could help me understand that. Once I had exhausted my home library and watched all the movies and read a lot about her, for me, having made that pilgrimage I told you about when I was 21, it just made a lot of natural sense for me to go back again to England and to follow in her footsteps and to try and feel her presence as much as possible. So we have been taking trips as a family. We had a wonderful vacation to Italy. We renewed our vows in the heart of Tuscany in a little chapel. My husband took a trip to Augusta, Georgia to watch the Masters tournament with some friends. And I put up my hand and I said, I'd like to go to England on my own. I love all of you, but I would like to have a week alone in Chawton because I've never had that since I was very young. And it happened to be the 200th anniversary of the passing of Jane Austen. It was 2017 that summer. So I planned to go in September during the International Jane Austen Festival of Bath. And I arrived in Bath and I spent 3 days traveling every square inch of Austen-related Bath that I could find and attending some festival lectures and performances. And then on the Monday, I took the train from Bath to Alton. And I check in at the Swan Inn, which is the original coaching inn where Jane Austen would have loaded up for London herself. And I drop off my suitcase and I immediately walk to Chawton, and I can't wait to get there. I go into the Jane Austen's House Museum, but I had been able to go there every year for the previous 5 years. So I wanted to see certain things and I wanted to do it fast because I had the whole week and I really wanted to get inside Chawton House. So the things I love about the Jane Austen House Museum, the replica piano in the drawing room, her artifacts such as the lock of hair and the jewelry that's there, the bedroom where she and Cassandra slept, and most of all, that little round table. Every time I go, I stand by that table and I cry. And I look out that window and I think of her authorial eye and how she saw the nexus of the town, all the different parts of Chawton bumping up against each other on these 2 roads that split. One goes to Winchester and one goes to London. And I stood there and it was a pretty quiet time in Chawton because the festival was on in Bath. So I was alone in the room. Then I left and I headed over to Chawton House. This gets really interesting. This is where my book really kicks in. So I'd been to Chawton House when I was 21 and I found the photo for you guys. I'll hold it up so if you can see it. But you can see that there's no sign yet of the tourist site that it will become. It's a family home. It's 1989. It's covered in ivy. And at the time I took this photo, didn't know how important it was in terms of Austen's legacy. But since that photo, I had learned some of the amazing stories of the Knight family's inheritance and the selling of the lease to Sandy Lerner, a wealthy American, in the early 90s by auction over the phone. Story that I'd always found fascinating and I was already well aware of. So for years, I had been trying to visit Chawton when I was in England, Chawton House. And every time we're in Chawton to go to the museum, Chawton House is closed to the public. It's usually on a Monday. And I've become a little obsessed with getting inside Chawton House. So on this Monday, I get inside. And I remember seeing the dining room where Jane Austen would have dined with her brother and his 11 children, and the reading nook above where they say Jane Austen liked to sit and read, and you could look out through the window and see all the way to the road. And I thought, what a great view that is. It's a view that will end up, being in my book. And on the first floor, the English first floor, our second floor, you could look down through these stained glass windows into this courtyard. And that led to the kitchen, and then it led to a walk up an incline to a walled garden. And then I walked there and through the woods, and I saw the shepherd's hut, and I saw the ha-ha. and I ended up back in the St. Nicholas churchyard. Every single one of those things that I saw that afternoon is going to end up in a scene in my book. I just don't know yet that I'm about to write this book. So that entire week that I'm in Alton, I rise early every morning. I grab an apple from the buffet at the hotel, and I walk to Chawdon. And I am the first person to arrive at Chawdon at the Jane Austen House Museum in the morning. And I'm the last person to leave Chawdon House at the end of the day. And as a result, I do get to spend a lot of time alone in these very special rooms. And now I'm going to tell you guys something that I don't think I've told anybody. And I don't think I've told my family who are watching in the basement. But when I think it was like on the Wednesday of that trip, I caught a train to Winchester. And I went and bought some flowers in a market. And I went to Winchester Cathedral and I laid them down on Jane Austen's grave, which is something that I don't think I would have ever thought I would have done to someone that I wasn't related to or had met. And I remember being so overwhelmed by emotion, but also intellectually very curious as to why she was having such an effect on me when I had already loved her for, 50 years of my life. So that was a very moving moment for me that has always stayed with me. And then another thing happened that week that also I'll never forget. So one morning I'm waiting for the museums in Chawdon to open, and they're very early, and I've had my breakfast. And I was in the churchyard of St. Nicholas, which is right by Chawdon House, just trying to, kill some time. And I'm lying on the stone wall, and I have my little travel copy of Emma with me. This is it. And I had it so small so I can, carry it around. And I have it like on my chest, and I'm lying there. And I remember feeling so incredibly sad and worried for my husband and for my family in the next few years ahead. But I also remembered feeling so inspired by the beauty and the weight of history around me. The presence of Jane's sister and mother's graves right near me at that moment. And in that moment, for the first time in years, I was able to fully coexist with both trauma and beauty in a way that I had thoroughly failed at, especially the previous year. And I remember as I lay there thinking about how Jane Austen had also had to wrestle with uncertainty in her life, much worse. Tremendous uncertainty, both financially, her own health, the loss of her father when she was young. And I thought about how she would have had a dawning consciousness that she was going to have to leave all this behind, as medically unclear as her situation was. And yet she still wrote. I think she was sicker longer than we know. I think she wrote Persuasion with some sense of impending loss. Grief and losses just wound through that book. And in that last year and a half, 2 years of her life especially, Emma had come out. She was advocating for it with the publishers. She started writing Sanditon. She also dealt with, very generously, a lot of relations with literary ambitions of their own. She really gave of herself. She gave of herself so greatly that we're here today still talking about her 200 years later. I remember lying on that stone wall, and I remember something kind of happening inside me, and I was like, no, if Jane Austen can do it, then I can do it too. And it was just a really powerful moment that will always stay with me. So this is where it all gets very interesting in terms of my book. So I come back from this trip, and I'm now more obsessed with Jane Austen than ever before. I think my family was kind of hoping I would have got it out of my system a little bit. So I come home and I start reading again about her. And I bought this book in the gift shop of Chawdon House called Jane and Me. And it is written by Caroline J. Knight, a very impressive woman who also happens to be Jane Austen's fifth great niece. And this is a wonderful book. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in the Austen Knight family history to read it. It's about growing up in Chawdon House, being aware of the legacy of Jane Austen, but also feeling as a family the weight of inheritance of these buildings that are 400 years old, and the death taxes and the restoration costs and the maintenance costs. And this book really got me thinking about Jane Austen and Chawdon House as separate from each other. And Chawdon House is a family home. And I think that was the first beginning of the creative spark for my book. The next book I'd read before, but I dipped into it again because I really wanted to read this highly entertaining chapter 3 in Among the Janeites by Deborah Yappi. Because chapter 3 talks about how Sandy Lerner acquired Trodden House, its lease, and carried it forward into the 21st century. And it's a really fascinating account of the kind of love for Jane Austen in fandom that I was starting to feel myself. And it made me think also about how close we come sometimes to losing these really important monuments and the gratitude that we feel for the people that do pop up and say, we have to do something about saving this. It's important. The next book that I'd read before as well, thoroughly inhaled it again. It's called Jane's Fame by Claire Harmon. Now, this is a very interesting book because I'm emotionally responding to Jane Austen during this year, but I'm also intellectually curious as to why she's making such a difference in my life, why she's healing my pain, why I'm becoming the kind of fan that I'm becoming now at age 50. And this book is very much tracing the arc of the evolving fandom for Jane Austen over the years and the kind of fan that I'm now becoming. But it's also about the pigeonholing of Austen as that writer for women, that popular culture sometimes keeps her in that box, and which really angers me as a fan. There was also a wonderful account in this book about an assistant in the reference library at Yale who acquired through R.W. Chapman as an intermediary the topaz crosses that belonged to Jane and her sister Cassandra. And how people were wondering, who's this young upstart from the Northeast states buying this jewelry at auction? And it turned out that this librarian was engaged to one of the wealthiest heiresses in America and had bought her these crosses as a wedding present. For the writers in the audience today, I think there's a really cool story buried in there as well. And it really stayed with me. I found it just totally enchanting. So this is September 2017, and I'm back from my trip. And the very next month, this book comes out. And I think this is where the creative spark for my book really starts to ferment. It's called Reading Austen in America by Professor Juliet Wells. Now, this book is Professor Wells looking at the first American edition of Emma, which was done in 2 volumes. And I think it came out in very early 1816, when in, I think, December 1815 was the British edition. And she's tracing the lineage and the history of these books, and in doing so, she finds 2 more. So this is an account of 6 of these editions. And what was really fascinating about this book was the way it made me think about many different things. First of all, she portrays this delicious, wonderful 20th century friendship between one American woman, Mrs. Alberta Burke of Baltimore, Maryland, and a gentleman from Oxford. I think his name is David Gilson. They're self-taught collectors and pen pals, and they have their hands on these editions over time. And Mrs. Burke was also the person Professor Wells is describing in her book, but also in one of her earlier books. Mrs. Burke is the person who was at a society meeting in England in 1949, where T.E. Carpenter, one of the founders, was bemoaning Americans' access to these artifacts. And she had recently acquired Jane's lock of hair at auction. I think, maybe not, but she had it. And in her only known public speech, she stood up in the meeting and she was like, okay, here, you can have a lock of hair. And I remember there was something about that story as well. So I dog-eared these pages because I just remember thinking that's so interesting. And these 2 people were not necessarily collectors in the traditional sense. They were collecting for their own very personal reasons. So I think something else that came out of this book, Reading Austen in America, was, I'm reading the chat room. I'm going to get distracted because there's like these fascinating comments, much more fascinating to me right now than my own book. There's a section in Professor Wells' book where she talks about how there was a family, I think it was at least 2 American daughters, who struck up a correspondence with Jane Austen's brother in his very, very late years in the 1850s. And she talks about in conjunction with the rise of Austen-related pilgrimages, like I had just made. And the letter of introduction that the Americans send to Admiral Austen mentions that they were introduced to the joys of Jane Austen through the late Chief Justice of the United States of America and one of his associates, Justice Story. And I remember reading that and I thought, oh, I love that. As a lawyer myself, and thinking about my friend's father that I discovered reading Pride and Prejudice when I was young. I don't know if I mentioned, but he was a partner in a law firm. So I always kind of connected Jane Austen or love of Jane Austen a lot with the legal mind, because I do find that she is so highly logical in her prose. And I love that there were these American male lawyers in the 1800s that loved her as much or more than me. So that also, I think, got into my creative DNA at this point. So spurred on by all four of these books, I start to just keep reading whatever else I can. I still don't know, though, that I'm going to write my book. So in happier days ahead, in the spring of 2018, my family gets through a couple of medical appointments in a row for my husband, where his lung function has stayed stable. And that, I think, was just enough to give us as a family the sense that we could bank on maybe a bit more time than we've been told. And when you feel that, you are feeling hope again, which is always in sad supply, especially now. So I was very grateful to feel that I could maybe start to plan again for the future. And I don't think it's a coincidence at that exact time I started to think about writing again for the first time in 10 years. I had taken a 10-year break from writing or trying to get published. Now, I didn't know at first I was going to write about Jane Austen. I'd also been watching a lot of Downton Abbey on a loop, and I've been watching a lot of House and Garden TV and shows, you know, where real estate shows. So I thought at first I was going to write a story about a group of people that just come together to try and save an old British estate home. But somehow, obviously, this year of aggressively rereading Jane Austen or about Jane Austen and the trip that I had taken all started to kind of culminate creatively in my brain. And then something really wonderful happened. I was turning 50 in April of 2018, and I treated myself to my first trip to Philadelphia because I wanted to go to this. I asked my daughter if she'd come with me, and she said yes. So we go to Philadelphia, and we go to the JASNA Eastern Pennsylvania Region's meeting on the power of persuasion. We partly go because we're huge fans of the film director, Whit Stillman, and he's going to be one of the speakers that day. But so is Professor Juliet Wells, and I was so in love with her book, which for me as a lawyer and someone who loves history, Professor Wells' book was like this perfect combination of academia and entertainment like I've never found. And I just really love that book. So I wanted to go see her talk. So Susanna Fullerton was there speaking that day as well. She's the president of JASNA's, of JAS Australia. And Professor Lynn Festa gave a speech called Finding Comfort in Persuasion. And a lot of talk that day was about the recurrent themes of grief and persuasion. And I was really affected by that. So my daughter says that it was shortly after coming home from this conference that I just looked up one day. I looked around the room and I said, no, I'm going to write about a group of people that come together to save Jane Austen's house. Now, right from the start, I knew that my book was going to be completely fictional. And this is very important because I get asked this a lot, and I really want to explain my thinking on this. I am only a novelist. I can't write a short story. I could never write a blurb for a cereal box. I am somebody that has to write many characters. And my book has 8 main characters, which I'm told is a lot. I'm told it will be difficult to adapt for film and television as a result. But I'm somebody who likes to set in motion a bunch of different people. I like to have head hopping, multiple points of view. I like them to bang up against each other. And then I write to find out what's going to happen. And it's only because I don't know what's going to happen that I am going to write until word 90,000. And that's the kind of writer I am. That's the only skill set that I have fostered over decades of trying to get published. So because I knew from the start my book was going to be fictional, and I didn't want to in any way disrespect real life people. That's the lawyer in me. I didn't want to impute to anybody a motive or an experience that hadn't happened in real life. And I didn't want to be constrained as a fiction writer by real life events and organizations. So I decided right away that I would fictionalize everything and everybody. And I remember thinking, if I just make everything up, then I can't go wrong. I also knew if I kept everything fictional, then that I could let my imagination fly. Because I don't plot or outline in advance, the fun for me in writing, the joy and the inspiration, the only reason I do it is to find out what's going to happen. So I wanted to be able to feel that free as I wrote. So the result is I knew only 3 things about my book when I started. First of all, I did know it would be called the Jane Austen Society. And I knew that a society would therefore be formed in the book. And I also knew that I wanted to have a lot of characters, 8 to 10. And I wanted them to be evenly split, men and women, because I wanted, in my very small way, to kind of reclaim that male fandom for Jane Austen that I think popular culture has ignored. And apparently I wrote it all on a sheet of paper. So when I was preparing for this, I found this. I've never shown this to anyone. I showed it to my agent yesterday. So I wrote on this sheet of paper my new book, and I wrote the JAS, but I've crossed out the. So apparently at some point, I thought it was just going to be called Jane Austen Society. I think it's better this way. Then I wrote on this page, 8 to 10, maybe more jobs. And I look at this and I can see farmer, writer, editor, historian, failing estate holder, town doctor. I don't see an auctioneer and I don't see a movie star. I don't see a servant girl. I don't know yet that they're about to appear. That's all the planning that I did for my book before I sat down to start typing. First day that I sit down, I type the words, the Jane Austen Society and chapter 1. And then I just sit there and wait. That's what I always do. I just sit there and wait. And the very first image that comes to me is of a man lying on a stone wall in the St. Nicholas churchyard. He's very sad, very lonely. I don't know why yet, but looking back, I can now see that I was channeling my own emotions. He's feeling very dead inside. He's feeling death all around him, and he's struggling with how to find hope. And clearly what I was doing when I started to write that was re-experiencing and returning to this moment that I now see was so important in my own life. And then it's page 2, and I'm like, okay, kids, something has to happen. And I have the old trope of the stranger comes to town. And I have an American woman show up, and she's me. She's lost, like I've been, trying to get into the museum. Well, it's not a museum now. She's trying to find the cottage where Jane Austen lived. And she starts talking to the farmer, and he cops to the fact that he's never read Jane Austen. She's like, that's nuts. Like, you live here. You have to read her. So he goes and he takes Pride and Prejudice out of the library. And I love that first chapter because we're really channeling that experience, or at least I am when I'm reading it, of when you first fall in love with Jane Austen, you first fall into the rabbit hole. So he's reading Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It's going fast. And I'll never forget, I typed the line out of the blue. He was becoming quite worried for Mr. Darcy. And I knew right away what my book was going to be about. It's going to be about a bunch of people, lonely and damaged, just like this farmer, all in love with Jane Austen, and then learning to love and fall in love themselves, and bonding with each other over favorite passages and favorite characters, and living and working their jobs that are so important to them in a small town during a time of war. There's so much loss that they're having to survive. But a time in history when people were still not quite fully paying attention to the important landmarks in the small village. And I remembered the excitement as I'm writing chapter 1. And it's building inside me that, oh, if I write this book, because, writing a book's a little bit of a commitment, it's going to be many years of your life. As I'm writing, I go, oh, I get to just keep thinking and talking about Jane Austen, because I was clearly not ready to leave her world. I mean, all that research, reading and writing clearly had somewhere it still needed to go. And this was going to be kind of like a great exorcism for me. And I realized that not only would my book be a way for me to stay close to Jane Austen and stay in her world of characters, but also stay close to Chawton as well. And one of the great delights for me was, as I was writing my book, I could feel like I was still in Chawton. And I'm so grateful I had that week and that I took that week, because I could remember every house, every laneway I walked. I walked that week on my own every day all over Chawton. And I would go days without talking to anybody except my family back home on the phone. And I remember every front garden and every painted front door. And it just felt so real to me as I wrote. So before I can start writing a book, I need to know those three things. I need to know time period. I need to know the setting. And I need to know the stakes. I've talked to my agent about this. I kind of need to know what's at stake so I could write towards it. But the thing that I don't know yet is I don't know anything about the characters. And for those of you in the audience that are writers who are pantsers like me, which means we're not plotters, we sit down and we just start to write. We fly by the seat of our pants. We have no idea what's going to happen. There is nothing more fun than when your characters just show up on stone walls and in doorways, on benches. Like it's a real trip. I highly recommend it. So my characters, because they just show up out of the blue, when they do, they're fully formed. I can actually picture everything about them, but I can't picture their facial features. Those always remain a little fuzzy to me, but it allows me to stunt cast in my brain for movies. So I love that part. I never quite see their faces, but I know everything about them. And I follow them along. They drive the plot. So often they're doing things and I don't know why yet. That's my creative subconscious mind working. And I'll give you some more examples soon because it's a really fascinating for me as a writer. It's the best part of writing for me. But the other thing to let you know is that when I write, my characters, I don't see through my characters out into the world the way some of my friends who write, who also don't plot, have told me they do. I look down on my characters, that omniscient point of view, as if I'm looking like a film director down through a camera. So I'm always sort of looking down on them as I start to write. And then I'm just writing down the film reel as it's unspooling before me. My daughter's a writer as well. And she says it's the exact same way. And her creative writing teacher told her, do not tell anybody that's what's happening. So, but that is how it feels for me. And then when I'm looking down on them, the next question often is, who else is looking at them with me? And that is how characters like Mimi or Marianne on page 2 show up. I will always have a weak spot for the character of Adam because he was the first character to come to me. And like I said earlier, he's the one through which I viscerally got to relive falling in love with Jane Austen for the first time. But on a general level, he's in every man and in every woman. He is all of us in a way because he is an introvert. And I do think that many of us are more introverted than society will allow us to be. And I love writing that first chapter and exploring his reactions to Mr. Darcy's total cluelessness about the strength of his physical attraction to Elizabeth and how it was really messing with his mind. He has no idea because he's so arrogant. And I loved his, confusion about the parents' relationship. And I also loved his concern for Mr. Bennet's behavior because Mr. Bennet is one of my all-time favorite characters in Jane Austen. But I have increasing issues with him as I get older. But then the next chapter I wrote, chapter 4 now, but it was originally chapter 2. It's 2 villagers on a bench. I only know that they're a doctor and a teacher. And in my mind, there's like a 30-year age difference because I'm not intending anything to happen between them except for them to discuss Emma. And as they start talking about Emma, I remember going, oh, this is so great because the previous summer, in rereading Emma for like the 20th time, still was discovering new things. And I remember wanting to share them with people. And I get a little emotional thinking about this, but I now realize that I kind of was writing my book in part so that I could kind of create my own little society, made-up society, in which I could share these little insights. And then something really cool happens as I'm writing this couple on the bench, is I start to, as a writer, pick up on this wonderful vibe of attraction between them. And I immediately, like in the moment of writing that chapter, telescope the age difference to a little slightly more respectable 20 years. And I think about the fact that he's a doctor and it's a small town, so she'd be his patient. He's probably the only doctor. And I'm thinking that, hey, wait a minute, age difference, socially inappropriate, what's Knightley and Emma? And it just like kind of came to me. And that was the very first moment in writing my book where I went, ooh, wait a minute, I could really have fun with this. I could create intentional parallels between some of my characters and some of the characters from Jane Austen's own works. So that was, I just remember that was such a great moment for me. And then as they're talking on the bench, I am looking down on them, like I said. And I realized that I am actually looking at them down in the courtyard through those stained glass windows on the second floor of Chawton House. And as I'm writing, I'm like, wait a minute, somebody else is watching them. And who could it be? It's 1945. Who is inside this house? And in that moment, that is how the character of Frances Knight came to me. And the whole storyline just kind of came to me at the same time, which is she will be the sole surviving heir to the Chawton estate. And I started thinking about how important wills and inheritance and entailments were in several of Jane Austen's books. And I thought about the real life Knight family and the stresses and tolls that inheriting these beautiful estates could be for families. And I knew that out of respect for the family, I needed to be very fictional. So I had Frances's father be born in 1865. And I had everything from 1865 onwards in my book. When I speak about the Knights, the Knight family in Chawton is completely 105% made up and fictional. And it's very important for me to get that across. I've put all that in a historical note at the back of my book. So compared to these early chapters, I think chapter 3, the auction scene, was very influenced by real history. So I'm writing this auction scene, and I don't really know that a movie star that's going to show up is connected to someone I've talked about earlier in my book. And then it all just made sense. Because as I was writing the auction scene, I was thinking about the story in Jane's Fame by Claire Harmon about the Yale librarian buying the topaz crosses. But I was also thinking about the real life story from 2013 of Kelly Clarkson, the American Idol singer and talk show host, and how she had acquired the turquoise ring at Sotheby's. And I think the fact that it happened in real life really emboldened me as an author to go, I'm just going to make one of my characters a Hollywood film star. But the wonderful thing about that is I'm a great lover of film. And it enabled me to explore some of, in a comical way, intentional film treatments, adaptations of some of Jane Austen's works. In this case, Sense and Sensibility, especially because I enjoy the Pride and Prejudice with Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier, but I think it's highly flawed. And I thought, oh, they'd probably do a pretty good, hatchet job in Sense and Sensibility back then in 1940s as well. So I was really having fun with those scenes. As my different characters come together and start talking about how to form a society to save this cottage, that is when I started to really most lean on and be inspired by real historical facts. So from reading Jane's Fame and different online sources, I was aware that in 1940, the real life Jane Austen Society had been formed in May, and that they had met in, I believe, Dorothy Darnell's front parlor, and that Dorothy Darnell had been inspired to gather them together because she had found piece of fireplace grate by the side of the road in Chawton. And she had said in her mind, this could have belonged, to the Austens. Like, what are we doing? So they formed the first real life Jane Austen Society in 1940, and they spend the years of the war, which are obviously, pummeling to the British pound and to people's finances. They're trying to raise money to acquire the cottage and turn it into a museum, and they can't. They post advertisements in the newspaper. Then shortly after the war ends, T.E. Carpenter, having lost his son in battle, buys the cottage outright, donates it to the nation. A trust is formed, and the Jane Austen's House Museum was opened this month, 70 years ago, last July, in 1949. So that's not how it happens in my book, but these were definitely huge springboards to my own imagination as I was writing. And now we come to one of my favorite storylines in my book. And I want to share with you the inspiration there too. Evie. So Evie is a servant girl in the great house in Chawton who works for Frances Knight. Evie was never intended to be a significant character in the book. But I think my creative subconscious mind really wanted to explore being a precocious learner and a young, single-minded, ambitious learner like I was and like my daughter is. And I think I wanted a young character. I think I have someone in every decade of life from teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s in my book. So I kept writing that Frances was passing a servant girl who was on her way to dust the library. And I wrote this 3 times. And the third time I wrote it in the book, in the first draft, I pushed back from my computer. I'll never forget it. It was like I'd been shot. And I was just like, what the heck is that kid doing in the library? It was this really funny moment. And I thought about, well, what could she be doing? Well, obviously she's looking at the books, but why? And I thought about how, well, maybe she's a fan of Jane Austen. And she's thinking, sorry, I think I've hit my time here. That was my timer. So how much, do I have 5 minutes left or 10?
You can keep going.
Okay, sorry. It's such a long talk, so I thought I should set the timer today. But I thought about how, because she was a fan of Jane Austen, that she might have wondered, ooh, maybe Jane Austen read some of these books, and maybe this could be kind of a neat, way to kind of pull together a sense of what inspired Jane Austen. What I didn't know, but very quickly found out, as I did my sidebar research, I started going online and just looking up, the Knight Family Library. And I discovered that there's a real life organization called the Godmersham Lost Sheep Society. Their acronym is GLOSS, G-L-O-S-S. So it's so fascinating for me as a writer. Got this kid in the library, and I go online, and they actually have put online the catalog that Jane's brother, Everett Austen Knight, wrote the year after her death in 1818 of all the books from the Godmersham Park Library. They've become scattered around the world. So what GLOSS is trying to do is find them with the family seal, the Knight family seal, bring them home to Chawton House. They've also put on the Chawton House website the catalog for the Knight Family Library in Chawton House itself as well. I think there's one that was done, and there was one that was done, I think, again in 1908. So I went through the catalogs line by line, and I threw in a few little intentional homages. So I put in the Belinda by Maria Edgeworth and the Don Quixote, and then I also put in a book by Madame de Staël, because that was one of the authors that was in their original library. So this is an example of how, at some point right in my book, I became very aware of what I was doing. It was no longer unintentional, fly by the seat of my pants. I was really having fun building in strategically and intentionally these little parallels and allusions to Jane Austen characters or her life in real life and her works. And I, in revisions especially, tried to throw in as many Easter eggs as I could for like the really hardcore Jane Austen fans. So when you're reading it, if you know her works really well, sometimes I've put in a line or two. There's an animal that gets a very important name from Emma, things like that. So now we're going to head into the territory of spoilers, and I'll start to wrap up, because there are quite a few plot twists, especially in the second half of my book. But what I want you to know is that as I progressed through that first draft, I started to see that all of my characters were living with loneliness and loss. And I was well into my book before I realized that what I was really writing about was how to live and cope with grief and despair. And I find it doubly ironic, because that was exactly what I was going through the year and a half, 2 years leading up to writing the book, but that I still to an extent struggle with today. And I was also exploring how books, Jane Austen's books, but books in general, can connect and comfort us in times of trauma. And I was also exploring how important it is that there are people that save these incredibly important, significant landmarks so that people like me can go and visit them and derive such tremendous joy from them. But most of all, I saw with this story as I wrote, the ability for me to pay homage to Jane Austen as the greatest writer the world has ever known. And to thank her in a very small, but now quite public way for everything that she was giving me at that time. So as I continued to write that first draft, I not only felt very close to being in Chawton again, I felt very close to Jane Austen as a working writer. And I felt, I think, like a writer myself, really for the first time. For one thing, I was completely besotted with my characters. And even the rakish Hollywood producer, Jack Leonard, in a really twisted way, because he just would crack me up so much. He's so dumb. And I remember as I wrote him, feeling this kinship with Jane Austen and wondering if she had felt a similar level of affinity for her rakes and rogues. And I also, as I wrote, remember thinking that I wanted to bring my characters as close to the brink as Jane Austen did with hers, and pull them back just in time and give them self-awareness and good fortune and growth and give them a happy ending. We talk a lot about Jane Austen and her happy endings. And as I wrote my book, I became, I think, very appreciative that the happy endings for Jane Austen were not about or just about romance or even a simple structural resolution by using the marriage plot to the arc of her story and her arc of her characters' lives. I think she gave her characters the endings that she wanted them to have, that she thought they deserved, because I think she loved them so much. I think Jane Austen loved her characters as much or more than anyone ever has. And I think that's one of the reasons they seem so real to us. I think that's one of the reasons the books last. And I felt that same love for my characters. And I also, with my writing, felt that same, I think, impulse to create safe suspense for the reader. I think Jane Austen wanted people, when they were reading, I don't know about you guys, but every time I read like Persuasion, I'm like, oh God, does Captain Wentworth still really love Anne? Or Darcy and Elizabeth somehow going to get together? And I don't know how she does it. And I'm quoting, I think it's Martin Amis in the New Yorker, because he said that's how he feels every time he reads Pride and Prejudice. It just suckers you in every time. And I wanted to create that with my book in like a really amateurish, small way. I also really love the pride that Jane Austen has in her characters. And I'm thinking of characters like Elizabeth Bennet or Eleanor, Anne, Elliot, and Persuasion. And there's this wonderful letter from Jane Austen to Cassandra where she says, I think it's to Cassandra, that she was in a picture gallery and she's walking along looking at the art. And she's like, I wonder if I'll see my Lizzie today. And I remember when I read that going, God, she loved Elizabeth Bennet, because I love Elizabeth Bennet more than any other creature in literature myself. And I just remember feeling this kinship with her on that. In the end, in the process of writing this book, I think what I grew to most admire about Jane Austen was her commitment to her craft. Through the process of writing and all the work and research I'd done on her, I felt an awareness of how healthfully confident she was in her gift. I think she had healthy ego as well. And as a woman, a modern woman, I really love that. I mean, we know that she started writing from a really young age. We know that she really reworked her drafts. It's a tragedy that we don't have them, but we know that she really worked on these over and over again. And she corresponded directly with publishers. I think John Murray had never published a woman before Jane Austen, or at least one of her other publishers hadn't. And I just really admire that about her. As I prepared for this talk, which I'm now wrapping up, it struck me for the first time that I too had taken a 10-year break from writing the way that we think Jane Austen might have. We know that from 1801 to 1809, she did start the Watsons, but we really have radio silence from her in those years. Those were the years where she and her sister and her parents were moving around a little bit, both after her father's retirement, but then his eventual death, between temporary lodgings, having come from the stability of Steventon for the first, 25, 26 years of her life. And I think that the minute, she moves to Chawton, she's living in this cottage that her brother is lending to her and her mother and her sister. And the fact that every year, 1811 to 1817, she is revising, re-editing, putting out to the world, or creating from scratch these 6 masterpieces in what I consider to be the tightest time frame in literary history of production. And I realized as I was writing that having any degree of certainty, for me, even being told that my husband might have more time than we feared he did, was just enough hope to get me to think about writing again and to commit to it. And I think not having a permanent home, and I think the grief over her father, who was one of Jane Austen's huge champions and facilitators of her talent, I think that contributed to her not writing in a similar way. And this also made me feel close to her as a working author. So in conclusion, when I finished writing the first draft of the Jane Austen Society, it's about 55,000 words. And I gave it to my husband, who is my first and often my only reader. And I'll never forget it. He finished it and he looked at me and
Natalie, we lost you.
She's not in the participant list anymore.
It could be her power went out.
While we're waiting, does anybody want to make any comment? I'm calling her right now, guys. So she's lost her power and she's getting back in. So let me just tell everyone we're recording this and we're going to post the video on our private with a private link on the our YouTube channel. So we have to figure out how to do that, but that's our plan. It may take a little while. So we'll also do a transcript so people who have difficulty hearing will be able to read that along with watching it. So as she's calling back in, I just wanted to let you guys know that. We'll also share the chat. If anybody hasn't let us know where they're calling in from, please go ahead and enter that. We'd love to know.
She's back in.
Okay.
so sorry. Are we okay?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, sorry everybody. Okay, so I'm back. So just to finish up actually, because I actually really was ending. So my husband looks at me and, okay, 1 second, I've got a problem. Okay, so my husband looks at me and he says, sorry, 1 second, I'm just gonna, okay, there. And he says, you know, I think you have something with this. And I remember it felt very ominous. And I decided very casually that I would just like send it off to some agents in New York who had represented other Austen-related books. And I send it out to who's now my agent, my wonderful agent. And he reads it on a Monday. And he emails me. He says, I missed my subway stop and I want an exclusive and then we'll talk. And so we talked on the phone and he signed me a couple days later. On Wednesday, when we spoke on the phone and he said, and I'll never forget this, he said, I get dozens of Austen-related queries a month. And I had no idea. And he said, but I don't think anyone has ever done the Second World War before. And it was at that moment that I had a sense of the commercial possibility of this book that I'd really written just for myself and my husband. So everything since then has been a debut author's dream. The book sold at auction in a bidding war between some of the big 5 publishers. And there have actually been, Susie, 4 more translation sales in the past few weeks. So I think we're at 14 translations around the world from Russia, South Korea, Brazil, Portugal, France, Romania, Estonia, Italy. It's really wild. It's wonderful. And last year I was able to take a private tour of Chawton House, the very house that I tried to get into for so many years. And in line with wanting to reclaim Austen a bit for men, I advocated for, requested, and got a male audiobook narrator in Richard Armitage, a very wonderful British actor. And when the book was released, it became an instant international bestseller in both the United States and Canada. And in Canada, it became a #1 national bestseller and has remained on the Canadian bestseller list for 8 weeks running. Most of all, I have made so many wonderful author and book industry friends around the world. In our current time of isolation and uncertainty and trauma and loss, I get to connect now with other people over a shared love of books, just like the characters in my book. I got to deliver the birthday toast for Jane Austen at the Jasna, New York region Christmas gathering. I have joined the committee for GLOSS, the Gomersham Lost Sheep Society. They invited me to join. And I get to be here today speaking with you. So for the past few months, although we are in lockdown, the world has come to me and my family in this myriad of wonderful ways. And so in summing up, you can see that it was with no exaggeration that I started off this talk saying that Jane Austen saved and has forever changed my life. So before we turn over to the Q&A, I just want to mention that I donated the honorarium for this presentation to the North American Friends of Chawton House. And I also made another donation alongside that because I will be donating 5% of my personal net profits or royalties from the UK sales of the Orion edition, which is not the North American edition, but the British and Commonwealth edition, to Chawton House through the North American Friends of Chawton House, because obviously I've been given so much. And yeah, so that's me. Sorry again to break out on everybody.
You weren't gone very long, and it all worked out. But we're going to start taking some questions. That was wonderful. I think, does everybody want to do a little reaction? You know, the reaction button here. A little applause there. Okay. So our first question is from Teresa. Teresa, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, hi, thank you. Natalie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great talk, really enjoyed it. My question actually has to do with your audiobook. So I'm really glad you mentioned Richard Armitage, who is such an amazing get. He really does your book justice, and even as he was narrating, I would find myself occasionally reminiscing about his role as Mr. Thornton in Gaskell's North and South. So my question to you is, were you part of any of the production process for the audiobook in getting Richard Armitage as the speaker and you know, providing him background, etc.? So, you know, were you involved in that at all?
Yeah, this is such a great story, but I'm cognizant of time. So I'm going to give you the highlights, which is that Laurel Ann Natras, who the editor of the book, Jane Austen made me do it, she and I had been talking for a while about how he would make such a great audiobook narrator. You should all know that when I was writing my book, I'm such a huge fan of his work in North and South. And he has that amazing emotive, rich baritone voice. So when I was writing, he was actually the voice of Dr. Gray, which was so wild to me. So when it came time to cast for the audiobook, they provided me with a list of 4 female narrators. They were awesome. They were wonderful. But I said to my agent, wait a minute. Most of my half my characters are men, and most of the scenes, if you count through them, involve men on their own or men talking to other men. And have we thought about a male audiobook narrator? And he's like, well, who are you thinking about, Natalie? And I'm like, oh, I don't know, Richard Armitage. And he's like, wait a minute. It turned out he was reachable because he had done Macmillan titles. He had also done Georgette Heyer on audiobook. And that, I think, like really helped everyone get their head around the fact that he would be doing, like, you know, a lot of these female voices. So that was the extent of my involvement in that part of the process. However, I was in California for the first time. I actually came to one of your meetings on Georgian legal justice in Jane Austen's time, right at the very end of February. And I woke up the Sunday morning with an 8-hour time difference to London, UK. My Twitter line has gone, timeline has gone nuts. And he has messaged me and asked me to DM him. And I did. And he wanted me to know that he had absolutely adored the book. And that was the extent of sort of my, you know, kind of correspondence with him. So he was already recording it when he reached out to me. So that's that.
Our next question is from Bonnie Seiler. Bonnie, you want to unmute yourself?
There. I'm 90% through with the book. I just learned about the session yesterday, so I've been reading and reading. And I was wondering, what are some of the best resources for reading the true story of the creation of the Jane Austen Society and the acquisition of Jane Austen House and Chawton House?
Well, my understanding is that the persuasion catalogs or documents through JASNA have a lot of, through the Jane Austen Society, have a lot of like the kind of hardcore historical background. But the book that I mentioned, Jane's Fame by Claire Harmon, she's got a good 5 or 6 pages in there that I really leaned on in terms of the story of the real creation. The websites for both Chawton House, but also Jane Austen's House Museum have a lot of description behind the setting up of those institutions as well.
Next up, Lori Dowell. Lori, are you still here? Okay, well, let's start. Lori, you'll be up next then if you're here. Jeannie Talbot.
Hi, yes. Wow, loved your talk, loved the book. I
Thank you.
definitely made sure I read the book before I knew you were going to talk here today. I loved hearing the background. My question is, have you heard from or have you spoken with any of the Knight family members about how you portrayed the Knight family and Chawton House, or any other details that they might have responded to or even perhaps criticized?
I have not. I did speak with Jeremy Knight when I was in Chawton a year ago, and I got the private tour, and he was actually one of their society meetings was taking place that day, and there was a lot of people wandering about, and I was able to find him and give him information on my book and let the family know. I've not heard from them directly. I did make sure that advance review copies were given to Jane Austen's House Museum and to Chawton House over a year ago now, actually, so that we could get their input as well. So I just want to make everyone, aware of it. And so far, everyone that I've dealt with, sort of like on a real historical level or institutional level, has been, really wonderful about recognizing the fictional aspects of the book, and how we did put at the very front in the copyright page that this was, a pure work of fiction, and to learn more about the real Chawton House and the real Jane Austen's House Museum, to then, go on to look them up. So that was a request made by the Jane Austen's House Museum. We were more than happy to oblige by.
Luana, are you here? You were asking, as a lawyer, how do you think Jane Austen's reward system works? Do you think the villains get away in the end?
That's such a great question. I think they get away in the way that in real life, people often get away with stuff, but I would never want their soul. So they might hold on to money. They might hold on to property. They might think they're even happy, but I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. And I think Jane Austen, kind of makes that clear with the Willoughbys, the world, etc., is that they are, maybe they even think they're happy, but it's an impoverished soul. And I think that that's a major morality behind her books. And I love the morality in her books, because what she's really saying is that it's in taking care of each other and in lifting each other up. And in these small communities, being vigilant, having a Miss Bates and her mother over for dinner, and helping each other through hard times, that we live a rich and rewarding life. And I think that's really the message, behind a lot of her books as well. So as a lawyer, I am at peace with what happens in the end of her stories.
There's someone with the phone number 949-503. Are you still here? You have a question? And someone else was asking about if it's going to be made into a film, if you've had any talks about that yet.
I will tell the screenwriters in the audience that we have had a few, we have had interest, but nothing has happened, beyond that. So we've had talks. I think it would be more suited as a limited series, like a 4-parter, as opposed to a 2-hour movie. I'd love it to do justice to as many of the characters as possible, not just from an artist vanity standpoint, but because a lot of people tell me when they do love the book that they found it hard to pick a favorite character, that they love so many of them. And I wouldn't want any of the characters to get short shrift. But so far, nothing's certain, yeah.
Melissa Buell has a question.
Hi, Natalie. What do you plan to write next?
I can't really talk about it, but I'm very excited because it all kind of went down about a week ago. It will be historical fiction. It will be set in England again. It will be set in the 1950s, and that's all I will say for now. But in a bookshop, I'll give you guys that too. So in the London bookshop, and I'm hoping there'll be an announcement this summer. So I'm very excited about my next project that I'm currently writing and researching at the same time.
Someone else earlier was asking about if you were going to revisit any of your prior work that you kind of had set aside.
It's funny. I wrote a book, my second book, and it actually made it to the semifinals of an Amazon contest. And it was a modern-ish retelling of Persuasion set in Montauk in the 1960s. It's kind of like a Mad Men for women. And I've always really loved that book. I think of all my books, that's the one that I'm sort of most haunted by. And I sometimes kind of would like to go back and maybe change the point of view or the narrative voice or the sequence. But I do feel that when you write a lot and you don't get published, you're kind of developing the muscle and the skill set. And it's not really anything that you should be going back to. I think it was part of coming to the now. And I do, for me at least, I think they mostly do belong in the past.
Jeannie has another question. Unmute yourself and then.
Sorry about that. Of course, I have another question. There was so much detail about a lot of the characters throughout the novel, and then at the end it just seemed to kind of wrap up very rapidly, especially with Adam, your little surprise ending. I wondered if you meant to do that, or if you just sort of said, well, that's enough. And can you talk just a little bit about how you managed your closing?
For me, I did feel that in having to set up 8 characters, you do have to have a little bit more patience as a reader at that front end of the book. And I did very much want at some point it to have a little bit of the feel of a thriller to actually kind of counterbalance that, because I was concerned that it would be perceived as just a quiet book. And there was a lot of things happening and a lot of plot twists. And as a writer, I wanted to maintain a certain degree of mystery. And if I slowed down and gave any more point of view, or probed any further, I knew I would tread into the territory of giving away some of the very hidden, so hidden that I didn't know they were happening myself, storylines at the end. So I, from a pacing perspective, wanted to make sure that nothing got sort of tripped up or like that the reader could pick up on anything. And I also wanted to create that sort of celebratory, it's all going to be good, because it is a heavyish book in terms of the themes. And I wanted everything to kind of like sort of happen all at once in a very joyful way. And for me, that was actually not dissimilar to the pacing of not, I'm not saying I'm like Austen, but, to that sort of approach to, we have all these characters and you have so much going on. I just felt that momentum worked. And I definitely have heard that from some readers. And I've also had, it's weird because it's a double audience. There's the audience of the people that know Austen really well. There's the audience that likes a quieter book, which my book is. And then there's the audience that's much more in tune with sort of faster paced thriller genres, which are so, dominant. And what's been really gratifying for me is that my book seems to be toggling between those three audiences because of the way in which I wrote it. So I had someone recently write to me last week. It's actually a friend of my father. He's like, I know nothing about Jane Austen. I barely read, but I couldn't put this down. Like, I had to get to the end. And I think that was something else I was trying to achieve with the ending, was that kind of compulsiveness, because I want as many people as possible to read this. I have no shame. I want to sell a lot.
Kirk had a question about the audiobook. Kirk, are you still here? Okay. Emily, do we have any other questions that you see coming in that I missed? We have a ton of the most lovely comments of everyone wishing you and your family well and being so inspired by this talk, Natalie. It's, I'll share those with you, but they're just an incredible amount of comments. Does everybody want to give a little round of applause? Anything else you'd like to say before we sign off?
No, I'm just obviously incredibly honored to be speaking before a Jane Austen Society and to talk so deeply about Austen and my love for Austen in a safe space. I'm so grateful for your time, and I'm just very honored that you would ask me to speak to you. Karen Joy Fowler, your next speaker, gave a blurb for my book, and her book was a huge kind of turning point, I think, culturally for Jane Austen and for me as a reader. So it's just, again, really, really wonderful to have been here today.
Thank you so much.
Did you ask, somebody asked if she's going to go back and have her previous books published.
Oh, I answered that.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so busy monitoring, I can't.
It's all right.
I think we got everybody's questions. If anybody didn't get a question asked, this is your chance. Kirk, I see your name coming up. Did you get your question answered? Oh, it's actually Karen Belovich, but you're coming up as Kirk, maybe.
She answered my question.
Okay. So everybody got their questions answered? We're good? Natalie, do we lose you again?
No.
Okay. Did you have a question?
Oh, website. So yeah, let me just say very quickly, I do have a website. It's nataliejenner.com. And there is a contact form at the back. So if you do have a question and you've had to leave or you haven't had a chance to ask it, you can message me through my website and ask me any question that you'd like to.
Okay. Thank you again, Nellie. We're so grateful, so thrilled to see you. Thanks for spending time with us today. We're all just very grateful. It's very inspiring.
Go have lunch on the West Coast, ladies.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.